About 2 weeks ago, a little under 2 weeks ago, I planned to do a live stream session for the Astronomy Ireland Starbecue event, in which I was demonstrating drone astronomy, and the event went very well. And I'd like to give a big thanks and shout out to Astronomy Ireland for facilitating this event, and also to my friend Boris Skalkin for accompanying me to the event. And we managed to get some really excellent photographs of the night sky, particularly around the Milky Way in the constellation Cygnus, Lyra, and um, uh, Cepheus, and so forth. So we managed to get some great pictures. Unfortunately, we weren't able to live stream the event due to connectivity issues and due to some technical difficulties, which came about during the event. But nevertheless, I'm trying to make this video now, which will showcase some of the details of how I managed to generate these very interesting pictures of the night sky. So here we have a image taken using my DJI Mavic Pro 2, my modified DJI Mavic Pro 2 Hasselblad camera, which is a 20 megapixel camera with a 1-inch sensor that has had the hot mirror filter removed by myself and replaced with essentially near infrared pass filters. So this is actually a near infrared image. Around the band is around, I guess, 700 nanometers to about roughly about the range of the sensitivity of the sensor, which is up to about 980 nanometers. So quite a large range, and I'm processing all of these images in Sequator. So these are high exposure images, and just as a follow-up from a video I did last time on noise, why do we do high exposure photography? It's to gather more photons in the image sensor, but we have to do this with a balance depending on our exposure time, the number of seconds that we expose photos, and the number of photos that we take. So it's a balance, and if we take less images, fewer number of images, but with each image taken with a high exposure, we get the best detail, but the worse signal to noise ratio. In other words, we get more noise introduced. So we have to then do denoising on less images taken, but each image is taken with a high exposure. On the other hand, if we take more images, a greater number of images, but take more of these images, each with a low exposure, we get worse detail. We don't get as much detail, but we get less noise. We get a better signal to noise ratio. So our high exposure images actually will benefit more from the noise reduction using the ROF algorithm, for example, which I covered in a previous video. So taking that in mind, I was able to do a number of tests, and likewise, I was able to have the camera expose at 2 seconds, 2 seconds exposure, 4 seconds exposure, 6 seconds, 8 seconds, and so forth, each taking roughly around 10 images or so. So here we have 10 images at 2 seconds, and likewise at 4 seconds, about 10 images as well. So they're all the DJI images. And keeping that in mind, the more we increase our exposure time, the more noise we're introducing into our system. So the higher the exposure, the more we're weighing down, if you like, this balance, and the more noise we're introducing to the system. But we're getting actually better detail all the time. Makes sense, of course, because if you think about it, if I take 10 images with 2 seconds exposure each, that means that I'm getting 2 seconds worth of photons in the camera, 2 seconds multiplied by 10, which will then mean that the total exposure will be 20 seconds worth of photons. Okay, but if this time I use 8 seconds of exposure time, and to take the same number of photographs, it's then 8 seconds multiplied by 10, which is then 80 seconds worth of photons, so a minute and 20 seconds worth of photons. So it's each time we're increasing the exposure time, we're increasing the number of photons. Likewise, if we increase the number of photons, that will increase the number of noise. So this has nothing to do, incidentally, with the image format. It doesn't matter if it's JPEG, PNG, we'd still be introducing the same number of noise, because we'd have the same number of shot noise, random excitations, and so forth in the image sensor, the longer we have it exposed to the environment, just say the night sky. So all that in mind, we can do tests basically. So one thing I recommend always in taking high exposure photography, particularly high exposure astrophotography, is to do a number of tests to see, based on the environment, the light pollution levels, and so forth, what value of exposure you need. So it turns out in high light pollution areas, you actually want to mitigate the amount of noise, of course. So you actually want to get a better signal to noise ratio in high light pollution areas. That makes sense. You want, therefore, to actually limit the amount of exposure time, but take more photos. But if you're in a region that has low levels of light pollution, such as a mountain or like the location we went to for the Astronomy Ireland event, you can actually get away with, therefore, taking more photos with high exposure times, because even though you're still introducing noise, you're not introducing as much noise, say, for example, from light pollution sources, from reflectivity from clouds and aerosols from the night sky from cities, such as the sodium vapor lamps or mercury vapor lamps or whatever they're using to light up cities. So that being said, I did a bit of preliminary testing, and how I did this testing was in Sequator. So Sequator I introduced to people who are viewing this channel from the last video, but with Sequator you can open a file, you can upload your star images, you can upload all of these images here by selecting them. I did this previously, and you can go through each folder that you can arrange your photographs in. So here I have the 2-second test exposure photos. I have 10 of them, and I can do different essentially functions on them. I can put them out as an output file in the same folder. So let's call this test v3, I guess, and there we have test v3. That's our output. That's a TIF image, so it's going to be quite a large image. Again, the format doesn't really matter, but that's the file format that the image, high exposure images, are generated as. So I can put our high dynamic range on. So this darkens the image somewhat, but it allows for lower saturation, lower contrast. I can reduce light pollution. I don't have to actually put that on because this was taken in a low light pollution region, and I can just essentially have high dynamic range on and let it run away. And this won't take that long because there's only 10 images to process. So it's working with the JPEG and DNG files both. So it shouldn't have too much of a problem with that, hopefully. The usual problem with some of the photographs is they can overexpose, they can change the features of the exposure, and they can overexpose the images so they can kind of white out some of the details. But we'll see how that went. Yeah, so not too bad. So this is actually the Milky Way, so you can actually make out some of the features here. For example, This is the constellation Cygnus, so we can see Deneb here, that star Deneb is here, and other stars I can show you labeled in a moment, because on the completed folder I was able to generate a completed map with a fair few of the features in this area of the night sky labeled. But 2 seconds is good, but it's not the best. As I mentioned, remember our seesaw here. If you are in a region with low level of light pollution, you can get away with taking more images at higher exposure because the noise will be less in terms of the light pollution. In a high light pollution region, you can still do astrophotography in cities and in relatively more light polluted environments, but you have to take more of the images and take them at a lower exposure. So in my experience, the max of exposure in light polluted areas will be 4 seconds. If I take them at higher than 4 seconds, 6 seconds exposure, or 8 seconds, it tends to become just like a whitewashed image. But in low light polluted areas, I can get away with taking them at 6 seconds, 8 seconds, and so forth. So let's see how it looks at our test. Let's say new project. Yeah, continue without saving. I can then upload star images from, let's say, let's skip ahead to 6 seconds and even upload only the JPEG ones. So we have 5 JPEG ones. The DJI Mavic camera takes photos in JPEG and DNG. You can actually see already there the exposure has already discovered a little meteorite. There were some meteorites that were in the night sky during this time, the Orionids. Even that image, you can actually kind of see the band of the Milky Way here and some of the dark gas clouds of the galaxy in the galactic disk, the dust lanes, so-called dust lanes of the galaxy. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail because they're actually very interesting in terms of their shapes. And it's also very interesting to note that most cultures have created constellations based on the stars, but there have been a few in history cultures that have actually created constellations based on these dark cloud-like dust clouds. And the most interesting culture are actually the Incas of Peru. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail because you can actually see some of the shapes in these photographs. But for the time being, let's do our same setting as before. Our high dynamic range on, our output, let's call it 6 seconds test. Well, I did a few of them already. Test V4 this time. And let's see how that looks. So the exposure this time was 6 seconds, taken with 5 images. So 6 by 5 gets you 30 seconds of photons in the image in total, which is you can go even higher. As I said, we can go even much more with the 8 seconds in this area. It really depends on the location and how much light pollution is in the area. Because this was taken in a place called Roundwood in County Wicklow, it was a very low light pollution area and it was such a clear night. We were very lucky on the night that we were able to take these photos. So let's see. Yeah, it's much more clearer than before. But we can actually use some of the other features. For example, we can do merge 4 pixels here to increase the sensitivity. This will, however, decrease the size of the output image. And we can enhance the starlight a bit. And we can also do some auto brightness because we can see some of the brightness around here is kind of washing out the brightness that we want to maybe see in the galaxy. And maybe just for posterity, we'll just put reduce light pollution uneven, but we won't put it at the maximum amount of settings. So we'll then output a new file, and each time it's good to label each one. So what we did was we said so reduce light pollution and enhanced starlight. So as you can see here in the different names that I've added to the photographs, we said auto brightness we left on, reduce pollution, and we got these much more enhanced images. So let's try it from there. And this will take a little bit longer because it has to do more post-processing, but it should create a very nice image. And at 6 seconds with 5 photos, it's pretty impressive how much detail we can actually get in terms of the dust clouds of the galactic disk. So it's all contingent on how clear the sky was, and in this case we were very lucky. Okay, so that's completed now. Yeah, so that's much more makes it a little more easy to see what I mean by us actually making out the dust lanes of the galaxy. And you can actually see there the trail of an Orionid meteor passing by. So it was actually coming from that direction, I think. The vast majority of meteors I took on that night were coming from that direction. And Sequator actually has a very nice feature that you can actually do time lapse of individual photos taken from this, for example, scene. So you can see here the night sky very clearly. You can see Deneb here. You can see what's called a funnel cloud, the funnel cloud in this so-called Great Rift of Cygnus. The Great Rift is actually here. And we see dust clouds, basically galactic dust clouds. These are just called dust, generically called dust. They're made up of actually many different types of material. And one of the reasons why I'm very interested in infrared, near-infrared astronomy is because we can actually peer much more deeper into the details of these dust clouds in the near-infrared. Turns out in visible light that these dust clouds are fairly opaque in visible light. Not much light is able to pass through them. They appear dark. That's actually part of their appeal in making constellations, for example, as we'll get into what sort of images we can see in these dust clouds. But in near infrared, it actually turns out that we can see more in depth into these dust clouds themselves. So you can actually see little stars in the dust clouds themselves here and nebulas. And that's why infrared, near infrared astronomy is appealing. It can actually sort of X-ray, add an extra layer of detail, but also peer into the actual features, the intricate features of these dust clouds. And this isn't taken with any optics in terms of magnification. This is the night sky as in the same scale as a human being would see it. The advantage, of course, using a camera is that it can be stationary and absorb more photons over a period of time, but also we can do modifications to it and allow take advantage of the fact that the silicon sensor is sensitive to a region of the electromagnetic spectrum that we're not sensitive to ourselves, namely in the near infrared. So we can see a lot more detail there, and that's at 6 seconds. But the main exposure time I was interested in using was, of course, the maximum of the DJI Hasselblad camera was the 8-second exposure. So we can see what the 8-second exposure test photo looks like, and with our star images we can upload. So I actually did an 8-second preliminary test here where I used again 5 JPEG and 5 DNG or raw images to create the image. But skipping ahead, I can actually showcase what it's like to do the full processing with the full set of photos that I took on the night. So I had here search never mind. I can just manually upload them, so I can add these photos and add another row of them. We can actually see begin to see some features actually already. We can see some meteors really bright on them. So we have 25 images here in total. You can see a meteor here. You can actually look through a few of them just we can look through a few of them here. 25 files in total. And we can do the same thing as before. High dynamic range on. We don't have to worry about noise too much. Reduce light pollution a little bit. Starlight a little bit. Merge for pixels. And we can do the same thing as we did before, and we'll be able to see a lot more detail. And put file. I did a lot of these before, and I'll show you them. So let's say 8-second test V5 or something. It doesn't really matter. And this will take a longer period of time because it's 25 photos. So each at 8 seconds, 8 by 25, you can calculate that. Then that's 200 seconds worth of photons. So 200 seconds worth is about 3 minutes 30 seconds roughly. So we have 3 minutes and 30 seconds worth of photons entering into the sensor with this exposure. So you can imagine how much photons we'll be able to make an image out of with this exposure. So exposure stacking is a really useful tool for astrophotography, and just keep in mind that this was all taken with a drone. So the drone was actually stationary in its flight. There was not much wind. We were able to have the drone more or less at 120 meters. So it was well above any fog or mist that was coming in. The night actually turned quite misty as the night progressed. So it was able to rise above a layer of mist, which is actually a very interesting and useful factor in applying drones for use in astrophotography. A telescope is stationary on the ground. It actually will absorb moisture from the mist coming in the wintertime in Ireland where this was taken. So having a drone which is able to rise above a layer of mist and be able to take stationary high exposure photos is definitely a useful let's say application of drones. And the fact we're able to do modifications as well with the camera means we're able to take images in the near infrared and create very stunning photographs, as we'll see. So that's 200 seconds worth of photons, and you can see a lot more rich detail than before. You can see yet again another Orionid meteor passing by the screen. And these images can actually be post-processed by tinkering around with the different functions. We can say enhance the starlight very strongly, reduce light pollution very strongly, and we can generate more features. And say if we want, we can turn the high dynamic range off, and that will actually make some of the details much more bright in this image. So let's say V6, and there we have it. So we can let it run again, and in comparison we can compare the two. So the high dynamic range makes the image brighter, but it increases contrast. But sometimes the contrast is okay in the base images taken as they are. But the main fact is that we can actually get a lot of detail already in these photographs, enough to point out the individual stars and to make our own labels of the maps. So it takes a while for it to process, but we'll come back to it in a few minutes. Okay, so that's completed. So let's take a look. Well, yeah, you can definitely see a lot more intensity of the individual stars. The starlight enhancement definitely does the trick, and we can see a lot more of the contrasts between the dark areas of the sky and the bright areas of the sky. So these are all star clouds, basically, in the galaxy, in the plane of the galaxy. So, and you can of course then see the comet, or not comet, meteor, Orionid meteor passing by. So that's cool. This software, Sequator, is pretty good. It is being continually updated, and it's free. It just accepts donations, and it's well worth supporting with a donation because it's such a good piece of software. Most of the good pieces of software out there don't necessarily cost money, and they just need to be, I think, promoted. So that's what we have in terms of our images. Some of the completed photos I took here, so of the galaxy dust lanes, you can see here they've been enhanced as well. If you can zoom in on them, so I have different areas. For some reason, it doesn't show up too good on the Windows Media Viewer. So let me just Milky Way Cygnus showed up here on photos. So the Milky Way region is between the constellation Cygnus, the Swan, and the constellation Lyra and Cepheus, the king, the so-called king constellation that you can see here. So here is Cepheus, the king, and here is Cygnus, the swan. So that's Deneb here, and the different areas I've actually labeled on this photograph. So we can have Deneb here as the star, Deneb, Sadir here, that's the other star of the that makes up the kind of body of the swan in the constellation. This is called the Northern Coal Sack. It's a region of the Galactic, as I mentioned, dust lanes. A region here is called the Pelican Nebula. This region here, you can kind of make it out, actually, this one pretty well. The Butterfly Nebula, that's kind of like the stem of the thorax or whatever of the butterfly, and that's meant to represent its wings coming out, kind of symmetrical nebula. That's called the North American Nebula, quite a large nebula. It kind of looks like North America, the kind of continent of it, the North American continent. That I mentioned is called the Funnel Cloud region. Here's a region called Elephant's Trunk Nebula, and this is a region kind of hard to make out, called the Wizard Nebula. And these are the stars of Cepheus. We have a star here called Herschel's Garnet Star. That's a star in the Cepheus, the King constellation, and that's called Aldebaran. That's I think one of the brightest stars in this region of the sky. Alpha here is also part of that area. So these were the stars labeled in order to basically indicate where in the sky this actually is. Now, these regions are interesting because of their stars, but they're also interesting, of course, because of their the dark nebula-like gas clouds. And actually, several cultures have actually attributed these to constellations in their own right. So we have here also a video made using the feature of the time lapse of the sky. So I can play it for you now, so you can actually see some of the features moving. These are, of course, meteorites, and there you can actually see a cloud, an actual misty cloud, moving across the sky as well. And there's a picture captured from this time lapse of an Orionid meteor passing by the Milky Way. So all of this is possible using drones in combination with high exposure photography. Now, one thing I mentioned was these dark sky regions of the galactic dust lanes, and actually it turns out that one culture that was very interested in these were the Incas of Peru, and they actually labeled different areas of these dark skies nebulas with different cultural significance. So they had a region that they attributed to a llama or a mother llama and a baby llama, and they also had a feature here attributed to a toad, and they gave them all different names, and this was meant to represent a partridge. So they had Hanpatu, which was a frog constellation, and Utu, which is a kind of a pheasant constellation, and a constellation of a llama, and a constellation attributed of a serpent or snake. And these were visible from a place called Cuzco in Peru, which was the capital of the Incan Empire in Peru. So Peru actually has a ton of astroarchaeological regions, which are actually very of high cultural significance, and they're one of the most advanced astronomical archaeological cultures in the world, and they were able to do a lot of investigation of the night sky. So there were all different regions that they labeled, not just around Cygnus, but around the entire band of the Milky Way, in which they labeled different regions. And we can see some of these regions in our photographs as well. So let's take a look. We can even maybe edit a few of them ourselves so that I can showcase some of the imagination that existed at this point in history of the Incan Empire. So I can actually take our Milky Way Cygnus photo and draw a few labels around it to give you an idea of what the ancient Inca people might have saw when they looked up in the night sky. Again, without cameras, of course, they were able to do this with their naked eye, pretty much, because again, the place Cuzco is actually built at the top of a mountain. The Incas were very mountainous, mountain-going people, and they were, like people of that time of history, very interested in the constellations, because the constellations were very important for their seasonal activities. So we can see here kind of the constellation of the llama. Let me just make it out with the size of the pencil. This region is supposed to represent a llama, I believe. That's the llama here. That's, I think, meant to be the head of the llama. Maybe that's supposed to be its eye. Something like that. Anyway, it's supposed to be like a llama. Here, it's not the easiest one to make out, in fairness. I don't think it's really, it's quite an abstract, let's say, representation of llama. One thing which is definitely easier to make out is the toad constellation here, the dark sky toad one here. That definitely, to me, does look like very much like either an insect or a frog or something. Some type of toad here, I guess. It's kind of has a kind of a toad-like feature to it. Maybe I'm not. Maybe again, it's hard to do it in Microsoft Paint. Let me just make it out here. Kind of very geometrically. It's fairly I guess, toad-like in some respects. That could be its eyes, and yeah, with the eyes here, I think, of these stars. So that's meant to be a frog or toad, basically. The partridge is supposed to be, I'm not exactly sure. I think it's supposed to be represented by the funnel cloud here, I think. Hard to make out. But the serpent is actually a lot more easy to make out. I think along with the toad, it's probably one of the more obvious ones. There's definitely a kind of a serpentine nature to this gas cloud for sure. This dark dust cloud, rather. So we have here the Inca constellations, dark sky constellations. So we have here Llama. They're pretty abstract, but this is what the ancient Incas saw as their constellations. Now it turns out that part of the so this is not pheasant, partridge. Yeah, so partridge is kind of like a bird. It's a bit like a pheasant. It's kind of like a fowl, basically, like a bird. Actually, it's a bird that people can eat as well, I believe. This is supposed to be a toad called hanpatu. This is supposed to be a serpent or snake. So that's the Incan constellation. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the region of the night sky that we photographed that night, along with the meteors that we took, the Orionid meteors going across the night sky. You can see them there. So thanks very much for watching. One area that I want to photograph again is the Orion Molecular Cloud Complex. I wanted to photograph it on the night, but actually because of the time and the mist coming through, and unfortunately Orion was quite low in the sky from our vantage point, I wasn't able to do it. But these photographs again showcase more and more that drones definitely have a bright, let's say, and wonderful future in the field of astrophotography. And one thing which was happily announced recently was the DJI Mavic 3, and that's something definitely that I want to, get my hands on to do some astrophotography work with at some point in the future, and to see if it's possible if any enhancements can be made to it, or if it can be used as a standalone astrophotography camera, particularly with some of the zoom features that is on the Mavic 3 that's been announced recently. So that's definitely something that's worth looking into. I won't be able to do it this year, but perhaps in 2022 that'll be something which I'll be able to look into in more detail. So thanks again for watching, and hope to give you another update on this area of research soon.